No problem.
Come on, Sebi.
Yeah, can you hear me clearly? Hello, can you hear me? Okay, I'm ready to start. Yeah. Hello everyone, welcome to the presentation. We'll get started in few minutes. We are waiting for others to join the room. Yeah. So welcome once again. My name is Aakash and I'm currently a postdoc researcher at NeuroSpin College de France and under a professor Stanislas Dehaene. Prior to this, I was a PhD student at the Indian Institute of Science under Dr. S.P. Arun. And I would just like to mention that in today's topic of like using deep neural networks to model neural activity, it would be more biased towards using in the visual modality because my training is in visual neuroscience. So, but I'm happy to discuss about other modalities and other applications of deep neural networks to model the neural activity. So the highlights of today's talks are as follows. So we'll start out with a brief introduction on like what are the different kinds of models that are present, and then we'll talk about the basics of deep convolutional neural networks, and we'll try to understand like how can we use the features of these deep neural networks to model the single unit activity as well as the population brain data. And then finally we will look at a recent research paper which uses like which very neatly uses this neural networks to identify the properties of neurons that evoke maximum which lead to its maximum activity. And please feel free to ask questions in between if you want to, and like if you have any questions. So so let's get started. So what are models? So models, like as been put by Rosenblut and Wiener, the abstraction of reality. Models are partial but imperfect description of the universe developed by science for our understanding of universe that is otherwise too complex to grasp by the limits of human mind. So we use models to simplify our like real world situations. For this example, if you want to model heart, it doesn't make sense to model each and every arteries and veins and model the blood flow and everything. If you want to study the mechanisms of pumping of the heart, and so you want to find the right balance between the kind of models that you want to build. For example, if you are interested in understanding like modeling the firing rates evoked in the neurons when they're seeing a particular image, it doesn't make sense to model at the level of new molecular mechanisms. Thus, we need certain level of abstractions to model, and that's why it said like all models are wrong, but some are useful. So the different kinds of models that we can talk about. For example, let's take an example use case here. So if we have a stimulus and it evokes certain response. So example on the left, we have stimulus of different orientations, and on the right, we have different action potentials evoked. So the questions that you can ask from this particular data are of usually three kinds: the what kind of, how, and why. So the what kind of questions are mostly descriptive, like what is the activity evoked for one particular orientation. So if let's say in this particular case, the maximum activity is evoked at a 45-degree oriented line. But if we change that angle of orientation, it may evoke a different activity. So what orientation evokes what activity is the kind of questions that we could ask. The second question is how, or it gives us more mechanistic insight into the underlying mechanisms. Like, so the question you can ask in this particular case again here is like, how is the action potential generated? And like, what kind of molecular mechanisms generate this particular action potential, that or the timings of action potential, how are they timed? Like, why are action potential more closer here compared to over here? And finally, the more difficult questions that you could ask is the why kind of question, or more explanatory questions. Like, why is this particular pattern of action potential observed? Like, is it the optimal kind of patterns required? Like, so if the brain wants to communicate the information from the eye when it reaches your perception, so the series of stages through which it is being processed. So the questions like you can ask is like, why is this particular patterns of action potential the most optimal for conveying the information from one stage of the processing to the other stage of processing, and why not any other way? So those are the three kinds of questions that you could ask. And in this particular webinar, we would focus primarily on the what kind of questions. So the traditional approach of modeling has been like, you have an input image, and a person or the experimenter or modeling person would extract the features for those from that input image and pass it through a machine learning algorithm. Would it be classification algorithm or a regression or any other algorithm to get the desired output? In this case, it's a car or not a car. So in this step, the traditional step, the a lot of effort went into identifying the right features, because if the features are doesn't like category, if the feature doesn't identify the image accurately, then the classification accuracies would also be low. So it was very important for to design the right set of features, and sometimes it's not possible to do that. But and the deep learning framework overcome this challenge. So now you're removing the feature extraction step and adding it into the algorithm itself. So now there's no manual uh, identification of the features that you would like to extract. So that in the deep learning framework, you pass an input image and then you have the desired output, and you say the network to learn the features as well as the classification on its own. So now it could learn some of the complex features which may not be interpretable, but maybe may help improve the classification accuracies. And so so then the many types of neural networks, like feed forward is only just one class of neural networks. You can see a bunch of neural networks. And so this perceptron was the most simplest neural network that was developed very early, and there were feed forward neural networks, and deep feed forward neural networks are mostly like because they have multiple layers. And so then the other different classes of neural networks which are regularly being used in the computer science and machine learning field. And there's a few more examples over here. And but this is a special class of neural network which we would like talk more about today, which is known as deep convolutional neural networks. So it is also a sort of a feed-forward neural network, but before the feed-forward step, which is shown in the green dots here, we have an extra convolutional layers. So the convolutional layers are applied on the input image or sound or any other format, and then the output of those convolutional layers are fed to the feed-forward networks. And so let's talk about a convolution a bit more. What is convolution, and why is it needed? Why can't we go with directly the feed-forward networks? So convolution is a mathematical operation, just like subtraction, addition, and all. So in which, let's say this is an input image over here, and then you have a convolutional kernel. So this is a sort of filter that is supposed to be learned, and then you apply it on an image from, like, you keep, let's say if this is a 3x3 kernel, which is a kind of a filter, and you apply it to the input image at a particular location. And what you're doing over here is that, so for one, there's a one-to-one correspondence. So you multiply each pixel image, like if we talk in terms of image, like each pixel value here with the filter value over here. So you can see that to get the output at this in the output layer, you multiply each of this term with its with the corresponding location in the source layer, like -1 with 5, 0, 2, 1 with 6, and so on, and then sum it all up. And what you get is a single number, which is the output. So now this kernel is applied at one particular location. Now you can shift this kernel to this particular location. like 012, 963, and 769. And then you'll have another output here. And so in this way, you can keep shifting the convolutional kernels and populate the output in the destination layer. And so this is the so when we train the neural network, what we're learning is the filters or the this corresponding values inside the convolutional kernel. That gives us the optimal. These are the features that we want to learn. Compared to feed-forward network, in which case all the units in the input is connected to the output in the hidden layers and so on. So why is it advantage is that it drastically reduces the number of parameters involved. So take an example over here. So if the input image is of size 227 by 227 and 3 color channels, and assume let's say there are 100 units in the hidden layer 1, then if the number of parameters or the number of connections that would we need from the fully connected layer would be 227 like by 227 by 3 by 100, which is a quite large number, because we need to connect each pixel with the corresponding number in the hidden layer. So it's a very large computational resources. And but in the case of with the convolutional trick, we only need to learn this 9 numbers. So the number of parameters are reduced by 9. Although it could be you can have lot many kernels. So but it's still a lot less number compared to what we'll have with the fully connected network. And if with this such large number of parameters, it's quite impossible to learn to extract the right set of features unless you're overfitting. And so this trick has helped to overcome the challenges that was present in the feed-forward networks, and we have been using it for many of our experiments. And so also the convolutional neural networks are not a new concept. Like although it has been very much popular in the last decade, but it was developed it was being used practically in 1989, and it was developed by Jan LeCun, and it was known as LeNet. So this network was developed for recognizing the handwritten digits, which is also popularly known as MNIST dataset. So in this case, the image was of size 32 by 32. It's a small input image, and you apply convolution layer filters on these images and pass it through subsequent layers, and then you have an output which says whether the uh, whether the which number it is from 0 to 10, 9. And so here you could see like the filter size is mentioned here like 5 by 5, and is equal to 1 is the amount of step size that you shift the filter to span the entire image. So these are some of the parameters that needs to be adjusted while you train these networks, and there's no obvious solution to that, but needs to be like tried multiple times and find the best optimal set of parameters. And so while this was successful at 1989, it didn't generalize to images because they were more complex, and also at that time there were less number of images. The data set was limited, and also the computational power. And during this, and around 2012, the AlexNet won the ImageNet challenge and using this neural network architecture, and it gained huge popularity. So the ImageNet, if you are not aware, it consists of more than 1 million images of different 1,000 categories. So that's why we have the output in the output we have 1,000 units. And so the input image size is of 224 by 224, and there are 3 channels for 3 colors, R, G, and B. So you pass this input image, and so through a series of convolutional filters, and then you try to learn the right category of the input image. So, and this was the first network, and you can see why it was very popular. Like prior to this, the accuracy of the on ImageNet dataset was, and this is the error rate that I'm showing over here. So the error was 26%, which means the accuracy was around 74%. So, but with the introduction of this neural network, the accuracy dropped by like 10%, which was a huge jump compared to earlier jumps that were seen like 1 or 2%. And this attracted the interest of a lot of researchers in the field of computer vision. And since then, it has been the different network architectures have been proposed, and which have further reduced the accuracy to a very high value. And it's already started with images. Now it's been applied to a lot of different domains for this, like in terms of audio, sound, audio decision making. So you have also heard of like neural networks which have been learned Go to play Go Atari games. So the reinforcement learning algorithms. So there are many such applications now, and it's being used in different domains. So coming to like what's so important, like, I mean, so if you look at this deep features of this deep neural networks, they're quite interesting. I mean, they learn the right set of features that we found even in the brain. So like if you look at the filters of in the first layer, you would notice that, I mean, the kind of orientations that have it, like features it has learned, are like oriented lines, like gabos that has been shown to be in the V1 layer of the visual cortex, and also color patches, which have been typically been observed experimentally as well. And as you go into the deeper layers, like in layer 2, you have more high level curve, like more complex features such as curvatures, circles, oriented lines, edges. So you have a bit more complex features. And in layer 3, you have more complex patterns like hexagon pattern over here, wheels, and so on. And in layer 4 and 5, like we see even more complex features like the legs of an animal or dog, or the faces of an dogs, tires. And so the complexity of the features, if you can be visualized in this case, and it keeps increasing from the layer to layer. and and this particular network, as you see, like they have very good classification accuracy. And primarily because, I mean, we can't, like a person cannot engineer these features on their own. They don't know what features to extract from these images, and but these networks learn them on their own. And 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 that's why they are able to get very high accuracy. So are there any questions that you can ask at this point before we go ahead? Is there any questions? Uh, if not, let's go ahead. So now the question is like, can we use this neural networks to predict the response to images? So before we directly jump to using the neural networks, there have been approaches in the field to use similar hierarchical architectures. So let's look at one of them. So in this study by Yamins in 2014, they presented images to in the monkey brain to the monkey, and they recorded from neurons in V4 and IT cortex. So these are some example neurons, like firing rate of the example neurons. So you could see like, so there are different categories of images that they show, and their corresponding activations are shown over here. But now the question was like, they try to build a model which to predict this neural response. And in this case, I mean, it's not a neural network or AlexNet, but it is equivalent to that in that it is a hierarchical architecture. But in this case, they predefined the filters were learned, and they had this nonlinear operation, which is the thresholding, or known as ReLU operation or sigmoid. And then they had this architecture where like you pass you apply this filter to the on an image, pull across or threshold it so that you don't have negative values or you don't have extreme values. And then you apply a pooling layer so that you pull across multiple filters, and then you go on to the second stage. So there are three layers in this particular manner. And in the output layer, their task was to do a categorization task again, or trees versus non-trees, for example. So the and this network was not trained to directly recognize the neural activity, but was trained on a classification task. And so they were wondering if the the parameters learned by this network, can that be used to predict the brain activity or not. So so here we are looking at the some other baseline models. So here there are three different units or neurons, and each, like you could see, there are different categories of images you can see over here. So like animals, boats, cars, chairs, and so on. And within each of these categories, there were multiple images. And so each the value over here unit is the firing rate corresponding to that image. So if you use a baseline categoric model, then it would, and if you try to fit it, then it would fit to some extent, because I mean you could see like there's a high activity for faces in this particular example. But in the other example, there are more spread out activations. So different units respond to have different preferences, and they like it could capture some amount of variance in the data, which is like in this case 15 units. And here each bar corresponds to a single different neurons, or this is the pop across multiple neurons. And the bars yellow lines indicate the median value over here. And so if you take a more realistic processing that may be happening in the brain, like the V1 model, which is a bank of Gabor filters. If you are not aware of Gabor, it's a set of sinusoid, like the values increasing positive, negative. So that also, I mean, that performs slightly better, but it doesn't capture all the dynamics present in these neurons. But if they look at the hierarchical model that they train, and if you look at the different layers like layer 1, 2, and 3, they see that the initial layer doesn't predict the data quite well, but in the later layers, they predict the responses to different images quite reliably. And they are able to explain 36% of the variance in this particular case. So, and you could see, I mean, but if you compare it to the neural network, if you use neural network, which are more deeper layers and has more complex architecture, then they would explain a lot more data compared to the model that was specifically trained to identify the neural activity. And so you could see, like, I mean, the change in the percentage of the explained variance, like from the low level early visual areas, like even like response explained variance is quite low. And like we have some 36% variance explained, or 48% variance explained here. And then you have, and if you look at the neural networks, they outperform all of these previous hand tuned models. So now, but the interesting thing that you notice is that, so if you look at the performance of this image, if this neural networks on the ImageNet challenge, if you're looking at the top one accuracy, then the models which have higher accuracy also has higher capability of predicting the brain data. So it's like, I mean, although you're not training on the brain data, if you do very well on the, if you try to train this network and improve the accuracy of these networks, then you will also achieve higher brain score data. And it's not true only for images, it's also true for the language task. Like in this case, like they're using different kinds of language models, from GLOW to GPT 2 and 3, and not 3 but two different versions of 2. And you could see here that the models which are doing quite well at predicting the next word are also very good at predicting the brain activity, and in this particular study, and they have looked at other studies as well. And so there's a nice comparison that shows that if you're doing good in this computer vision or natural language processing task, then you are also getting a better model of how the brain works. So now coming to a more general, like to, so now till now we have looked at modeling the response of single neurons, but now let's look at modeling the population level activity. So in this particular study, um, they showed subjects bunch of visual stimuli, and to and they recorded the MEG and fMRI responses, and at the same time they passed these images through a deep neural network. But so if you look, I mean, there's a challenge here. If you notice, like, I mean, so there are neurons in the, you get some certain recordings from the MEG electrodes, and you have activations from the individual units of these deep neural networks, and also you have activations from the fMRI voxels. But the challenge is that there's no one-to-one localization. You don't know if this particular unit correspond. Let's say if I take this particular blue unit over here, if it matches this particular blue unit or this particular blue unit over here. So there's no one-to-one correspondence between the location of electrode or the location of voxel or the location of the unit inside the deep neural networks. So how do you compare if the representations are similar across different layers or not? So to overcome that, what we're using, I mean, to overcome this challenge of mapping between the different units, what we do is like we use a representation similarity analysis. So the idea is as follows. If if these two images are perceived to be similar by the brain, then they will evoke very similar activations. So if you look at the fMRI data over here, so this is the activation pattern for banana, and this is the activation pattern for orange. Now you can compare the visual similarity, oh sorry, you could compare the similarity of these two matrices by first vectorizing them, like in converting into a straight vector, and doing a correlation or Euclidean or measuring the Euclidean distance. So, and the value of the distance between the two vectors is an indication of how similar they are. So if you take a correlation as a distance measure, then a correlation of one would indicate that the activity patterns are exactly the same or to a scaled value. But if the activations pattern are totally different, then the correlation would be zero. So the correlation value magnitude would tell us how similar two images are. So, and the same thing can be done for imaging electrodes or even the units of a deep neural network. So you could estimate this uh, representation dissimilarity matrices, or known as RDMs. So each point here indicates the the dissimilarity values between the different images. And so you could estimate the dissimilarity values at different time bins, like starting from 0 to 100,000 milliseconds in this case, or you could estimate the dissimilarity values from different layers. And you also could estimate the dissimilarity values from different brain regions in a searchlight manner. And so now in this, so this is what you get the representation space. And now this you can compare the representation space across these uh, different modalities. So you could compare, like, if I use a neural network representation, which layer matches which at the representation of which time point, and which region in the fMRI has better match to the representations in the visual of with the visual cortex. So, and this is what they see. So if you look at the earlier layers, then the representation match, this is the correlation between the two RDMs, that is highest in the early visual areas. And as you look at the representation of the more deeper layers, then the peak, which is the red color over here, shifts to more anterior regions. So it's shifting from the posterior in the V1 areas to more in the lateral occipital areas. They were indicating that the representation or the hierarchical representations captured by the deep neural networks sort of resemble the representations that we see in the brain as well, or the brain structures. And same thing with the time course. So these different colors indicate different layers of the neural network, and they're correlated with the, I mean, the MEG representations across different time units. So you could see that the yellow curve peaks it's highly correlated with the at the earlier time point, but this magenta curve over here, it peaks a bit late. So you can also see from here, like the significance. So the lines indicate the significant correlations. So the earlier layers are correlated in the from the early time points, but the later layer or the last layer is significantly correlated at the later time points. So again, indicating the mechanism of the, like, again, like, evidencing that the hierarchical representation in the neural networks also mimic the temporal representation over time. Um, so any questions at this point of time? Uh, if not, let's go ahead. So let's look at the one of the case study. I mean, this paper on, like, neural population control by the image synthesis was recently published in Science. And okay, so we have one question: can we use mutual information instead of correlation? Yes, so it could use mutual information as well. Um, but I think correlation is more intuitive way of using it. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for the question. So let's look. I mean, so this is the last part of the talk. So in this study, the question, then what they're looking at is, like, can we use neural networks to identify the best set of images that would evoke the highest activity in the neurons? So if we ask you, like, I mean, so I'm recording from different set of neurons and I show different set of images, and I see certain, like, some neurons, some images evoke very high activity, some images evoke low activity. But I don't know if that, what's the best features of that neuron, and what image, what's the image that I show would evoke the highest activity in that neuron? Can I identify, or can I synthesize that image that will evoke the max highest activity for that particular neuron or not? And so they're using these techniques, again, they're using neural networks to regenerate those images which will evoke the highest activity. So they're having two goals over here. So one was, like, to maximally, so in this study, they were recording from microelectrodes implanted on a brain, region in the V4 area. And so since this arrays, they were recording from a large set of neurons. So the question was that, can we identify an image that will overall activate all the neurons present that from which they are recording? So let's imagine a encoding space like neuron 1, 2, and 3, and they have certain set of activation act pattern. Like they have neuron, this particular image. So each dot represents one image, and so this particular image evokes this unit of activity in neuron 1, whereas other units evoke other unit activity of neuron 2. So can we identify an image which will increase the activations of all the neurons? So something over like in the red dots over here. Alternatively, like another thing that you could ask is like, can I identify an image that will only evoke the maximum activity for one particular neuron but not the others? So it's in some way like, can I trigger this particular neuron in some particular way or not, whereby suppressing all the other responses? So there are two things that they wanted to try over here. So let's look at the schematic of how they went about doing it. Uh, um, so 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 they had this neural network, and so they showed images. So they recorded from the monkey brain in the region B4, and so they recorded so they had this neural network through which they passed this image, and like we have seen before, they used the features of this neural network to identify the best activity for like best mapping between the features of this neural network with the neural activations in this case. And they passed a large number of images through this. They shown large number of images to both the neural networks and the monkeys, so that they have a very good activation, very good mapping between the features of the neural network and the brain data. But now the question was, okay, so now they have fixed this model. So this network was trained on ImageNet, so the parameters are fixed. So now you have also, by showing a large number of images, you have also identified a mapping from the features of this image neural network to the brain that can predict the neural data quite well. So this is also fixed. But now you could ask, you could reverse engineer it. Like, so instead of going the forward way from neuron to data, you could look at you go the reverse way. So you're now trying to synthesize the image that would evoke a highest activity in this particular neuron. So, so like you change the images in a gradient descent manner. So you show like in this particular, if you look over here itself, so you change the images such that the activity values keep on increasing. So let's say if you change one pixel over here or one particular set of features, then if you see that the activity value is going down, then you redo the operation and change in the other direction so that the activity values goes up. So in this way, like iteratively, you could keep changing the images and identifying the right set of images that would evoke the highest activity possible. And so let's look at the results. And so this is what they see over here. So let me go through this a bit more in detail. So on the x-axis, what we see is a predicted neural activity, and on the y-axis is the measured firing rate. That is what they get from the experimental data. And this, like what we see, like they've shown a bunch of natural images and also curvatures like over here, and they get a certain firing rate. Like some images evoke high activity and some images evoke low activity. So there's a range of gradient. But now in this approach of using resynthesizing the image using this neural network, like you're trying to regenerate the image, you could generate. So these are a set of synthetic images that were generated that evoked even more activity, like way more activity than what would have been observed through natural or simple curvatures. And the reason they chose curvatures here is because they're looking at V4 neurons and the preference is for curved stimuli. So you could see, I mean, the the features which evoke very high activity also resemble something that has been seen in the natural stimuli as well. So if you look at the statistics wise, so the amount of gain that they see over here uh, is about 39% over natural images on average. And if you look at compare it with the curve stimuli, then it's around 200%. And so here they generated images which have very high activity for a large number of classes, I mean, for a large number of neurons. but now they wanted to understand like can they activate a single neuron using images. So the traditional I mean, so if you want to activate a given region in the brain, either you have to do electrical stimulation to do that. But can we use a non-invasive approach like show an image and can activate this particular neuron or not? And they were successful in doing that as well. So if you look at this particular neuron over here, and like so you're looking at the site number different units. And so if you show this particular image, there's a certain activation profile for different neurons. And if you target this particular neuron over here, and so they using a similar approach, but now in the loss function, you're saying that it should activate maximally for this particular neuron, but also suppress all the other neurons. And if you present it like if you put that in the loss function of the while training the neural networks, you would see that the generated image looks something like this. And this image evokes a very high activity for only this particular neuron, but at the same time suppressing all the other neurons. And there's a few other examples of the synthesized image of at the different example neuronal site. So this is a stretch. These are the visual inputs which activates maximally for all the neurons present in that channel on the V4 region from which they're recording. And these are the set of images from which when shown to a brain would activate only one particular neuron that you're targeting. So in this manner, in this loop feedback manner, like train the synthesizing images to predict back neural activity, you could also identify the set of images that could trigger a one particular neuron. So what we have seen so far is like we have explored a different class of models and also the type of different architectures available. And now we have also learned like what are the feature space learned by these convolutional networks and how can they be used to predict the neural response while viewing images, although they can also be applied to other modalities of audio, motor response and other things. And if and can how can we use this feature map to identify the neurons which gives maximum activity. And during the course, we learned some of the prerequisite mathematical concepts and gain hand-on experience on building these neural networks to analyze the data. Thank you. Any questions or anything that would like to discuss?
Um, Sorry, can you hear me? Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Please.
Yeah. At the beginning of your lecture, you talked about different types of models, what, how, and what, why, and how models. So
Yes.
yeah, and in the last example, you were talking about the visual stimuli and trying to, like, for example, stimulate just one neuron corresponding to a specific image feature and so on. So
Yes.
can this be classified as a how model, or because we're not talking about why here, we're just talking about how the brain works, or are we going into the field of why as well?
I would say that it's also a part of what model because it's asking
Oh,
like what image, what are the what are the pixel values that I show would evoke the maximal activity for that neuron, because you're not underlying like understanding like how is the activity being generated. Like so because I mean, or to put it in other words, so because they're recording from V4 region in this monkey, we don't understand like we're not asking like how the features from the V1, V2 and so on are combining to give rise to the activity. So we don't have the mechanism or circuit information of how things or the activations are flowing from V1 to V2 and so on. So we don't have that answer. So I think this also falls in the category of what question.
I thought what models were basically finding the best formula or algorithm that matches the gathered data. And then when we go into brain mechanisms, we're talking about how. This was my inclination of different models. Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, from what I understand, I think yeah, this belongs to what category, because we are still trying to answer like what evokes maximal activity in this particular neurons.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. uh, any other questions? If not, we can stop this webinar here. Yeah, thank you all for your attention and thank you for listening. And if you have any other questions or anything that you would like to discuss or try to use neural networks for other purpose, please feel free to contact me or email. Yeah, thank you so much.